Hey Encounter, how are you doing? Good morning. Welcome to our daily devotional. We kind of like go into a little bit more depth of the topic that we discuss on Sunday mornings. This Sunday, we looked at this idea of how to have a hope and a future in terms of exile. And the main idea we talked about is, we're in this incredible i- interesting and also like awkward time that the peak of the crisis, right, kind of like it's like slowing down, at least in certain parts of the country. We're not in full lockdown anymore. We're also not back where how things were before. We're not back to normal, and we're kind of like in this in between space where it's not as bad, so to speak, but it's also not what we're used to, and a lot of times we don't know how to navigate that, and our tendency is kind of like to check out or to kind of like just become apathetic. And the idea of the sermon was that there's a different way of living, right? That we looked at the story of the people of Israel being in exile in Babylon and learning to thrive in the midst of exile, right? That God promises him a hope and a future right there in exile. And that's kind of like the core idea that we're looking at. And today I want to share with you something related to that. One of the things that we looked at on Sunday was this concept that learning that just because things aren't ideal, that things aren't what we used to hope they would be, it doesn't mean that we cannot build a life in there. And there's this verse in the book of Genesis that makes me think about that a lot. It's if you're familiar with the story of Joseph, Joseph is one of the children of Jacob. His brothers are very jealous of him, and they end up basically faking his death and selling him into slavery. And that kicks off the adventures of Joseph for many years. He ends up, working for this very important man in Egypt. His wife tries to seduce him. He rejects her, so she accuses him of attempted rape, and he's thrown into prison, and he spends many years in prison. But even in prison, Joseph's life flourishes, and he, becomes a key person in there. And eventually, the way the story goes, he ends up, working for Pharaoh and becomes like the second person in command, like the Bible uses term like the governor of Egypt. He becomes like the chief of staff of the Pharaoh, and in this kind of like incredible turn of events. And towards the end of the story, Joseph's brothers, or the ones that sold him into slavery, they're in Egypt now because there's this famine that has fallen over the whole land, and Canaan, where they're living, like the famine basically pushes them out of the land. And they're with Joseph, and they're afraid that Joseph is going to kill them, to punish them for what they did to him. And Joseph is trying to reassure them that that's not what he's going to do. And this is what he uses, kind of like to explain. This is in the book of Genesis, chapter 49. And I'm just going to read verse 19. It says, "But Joseph said to them," meaning his brothers, um, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." Um, when you to kind of like think about this, there's different terms for this. I kind of like make up like my own term. I call this like the principle of the different future. Um, I'll show you what I mean by that. Uh, Part of the problem that we have a lot of times is that it's very hard for us to process difficulty in a healthy way. So depending on your theological persuasion, or you either believe that it was ordained by God, that because God is sovereign and God basically not only allowed you to suffer, but caused you to suffer. Because he wants to glorify himself somehow, and like once you, maybe that means that you learn something through your suffering, or that your suffering becomes kind of like a picture of the gospel, and people come to Christ and whatever. And listen, many Christians that I respect believe that, and that's great. I don't share that view for a number of theological reasons I can share with you, but fundamentally it's because of the reason that there's no way of you believing that and not having some form of like very disturbing, like abusive relationship with God, where you think that God is always just making you suffer, and he gains some sort of pleasure from your suffering. And I don't see that in the God of the Bible at all. Um, but then we don't know what to do with suffering. So a lot of times what happens is that when a difficult situation happens, um, our tendency is to kind of like think almost like God is aloof, right? So maybe God didn't make me suffer, but well, clearly this is happening to me. So that means that maybe God doesn't care. Like maybe God's kind of like up in the sky and like unengaged. And because we think that, it's hard for us to believe in any sort of future for our lives. Because or like have hope that God will bring us a future for our lives, because we think that God is kind of like disengaged up in the air, and like he doesn't care about exactly. It's only where we can kind of reconcile the idea of God's sovereignty or suffering. I look at it a different way. The way I think, and I could be wrong. I could be entirely wrong. I'm not the only person that thinks that. There's many theologians and Bible scholars that believe that it's not like a fringe position. But I think that there's another way of understanding this, and it's that God, even though God is sovereign, and even though God has power over everything, that God, because God's primary motivation is love, and love is incredibly relational, God gives his people, everybody in the world, like the freedom to make decisions, and those decisions have consequences. And it doesn't mean that God is aloof. It means that God has given his creatures agency, and that agency has impacted how we live our lives and the things that happen. Now, what I do also believe is what Joseph says here. He says, you intended to harm me. So he says, like, well, his brothers had agency, and that agency meant suffering for Joseph. But then he says, but God meant it for good. And I think that what he's saying is that in the same way in which, we can be victims or suffer because of the agency that other people have, that doesn't count God out of the picture. That God also has agency, and God also is moving. A lot of times God is moving behind the scenes. And what happens in this case is that Joseph finds himself in a situation that's not what things should be, right? He was, a normal boy, and he was a brother, and has family, and had like a great future ahead of him as a shepherd in Canaan. And because of the evil of other people, because of circumstances outside of Joseph's control, he finds himself in these terrible situations, from being, falsely accused of a crime that he didn't commit, to spending unfairly like years in prison, and obviously also to having been betrayed by his family. And in the midst of all that, the way that Joseph sees the world is, well, this thing happened, and it shouldn't have happened. It's not okay that it happened. But God can use that for good. And you've heard about it. Like people have, if you've heard any sermons about like Romans, like the whole idea, like we know that all things work together for the good of those who love God. But there's something interesting, because then he says he meant it for good, for the saving of many lives. So it's almost like Joseph saying, listen, God would have saved lives in whatever ways, but because of the decisions that you guys made, this is the way in which God has now moved in the world to save lives. He's used the suffering that you've caused me to move history, to move events in such a way that many lives can be saved. And I guess part of what I'm trying to say is, if you connect this to Sunday, is it's incredibly hard for us to imagine a future in the midst of suffering, because our immediate kind of like reaction or tendency is to try to we can only imagine a possible ideal future, right? The perfect, house, and the 2-car garage, and the 2.5 children, and the nice income and retirement account, like this picture perfect way of life. And when that gets shattered, we're like, well, it's out the window now. Like, what can be possible? And what Joseph believes is that somehow, no. Listen, whatever happens, whatever suffering comes my way, God can take that and make a new future. And it might not be the future that I originally would have wanted for me. It might not be the future that should have been, right? Like what happened to Joseph shouldn't have happened. Joseph should not have been betrayed by his brother. I want to be very clear about that. That was wrong. The brothers of Joseph betraying him was wrong. Joseph being falsely accused of sexual assault, that was wrong. Joseph being forgotten in jail for years and years, that was wrong. These things were not okay. But even though these things that were not okay happened, God, through those things, in His sovereignty and in His power and in His love, moved and weaved and orchestrated history and kind of like guided things in such a way that this new future could have happened. Maybe Joseph could have had a future where he just grew old as a shepherd and had a nice family and a quiet life. And that would have been great. And it would have saved him so much suffering. But that was not what happened. Because of the agency of other people, he finds himself in this place. And in this place, God gives him a future. And it's a different future. In so many ways, it's kind of like a better future, right? Like now he's like a governor of an empire, and it has like all this power and all this influence, which you wouldn't have otherwise. All that is to say, I don't know in what, aftermath of what you find yourself. Maybe it's the aftermath of COVID, and you've lost jobs or prospects, or you have dreams that you have on hold, and maybe it's a relationship, maybe it's divorce, maybe it's something in your life, a health issue, I don't know. But whatever it is, there's two tendencies, right? One tendency is to either believe that God is causing this to happen on purpose to make you suffer, or believe that God is completely disconnected from your situation. And in the story of Joseph, and honestly in the story of Babylon, and the people of Israel in exile, we see a third option. And that is, people have agency and people do things. People betray, people lie, people hurt us. People are corrupt and steal. People are incompetent and make wrong decisions. All these things happen. We live in a world of people with agency. And in the midst of that agency, other lives are affected. Sometimes our lives. And sometimes our lives suffer because of that. And yet, in the midst of that, God moves. And in the midst of that, God can create a new future and a better future for us. And maybe it's not what it could have been. It's not what you imagined it to be. It doesn't mean that it won't be good. It doesn't mean that God cannot take that thing that was meant for evil and guide it towards the good for the saving of many lives. So in whatever situation you find yourself today, in maybe in the shambles of a relationship, in the shambles of a dream that you know it's no longer there, if God is the God who is guiding history towards its ultimate redemptive purpose in Jesus Christ, if God has acted in history in Jesus Christ, that means that God's also acting in your life and guiding your life, and that a better future and hope are possible even when it doesn't seem like it could be possible. Let me pray for you. God, we pray this morning. And my desire is that my friends, my brothers and sisters watching this, God, that in the midst of whatever situation they find themselves, in the midst of whatever pain or suffering they might be experiencing, that they would know that regardless of whatever situation, that the same God that, turned what was meant for evil in the life of justice and turned it for good, for the saving of many lives, is the God that's guiding history. It's a God that's moving in our lives. And that in whatever situation, even if the future that we want it can no longer be, it doesn't mean that there's not a good future ahead. In the name of Jesus, we thank you. Amen. Thank you guys for tuning in. See you tomorrow. Grace and peace.